The bird that suddenly went silent. There's a sound that most people take for granted. You hear it on quiet mornings. You hear it while drinking coffee on the porch. You hear it while walking through your backyard without even thinking about it. A bird singing. Not a rare bird. Not an exotic bird. Just an ordinary backyard bird going about its day. And that is exactly why its silence matters. Because one day that sound might disappear. Not gradually. Not over months. But in an instant. One moment the air is filled with birdsong. The next moment everything goes quiet. If you have ever experienced this, you know how strange it feels. The silence does not feel peaceful. It feels different. As if the world has paused for a reason you cannot quite understand. Most people ignore it. They assume the bird flew away. They assume the day simply changed. But nature rarely changes without a cause. And the truth is that a bird that suddenly stops singing may be sending one of the oldest warnings in the natural world. A warning that existed long before weather forecasts, long before security cameras, long before modern science. For thousands of years, people who lived close to nature paid attention to these moments. They knew that animals often react to danger before humans can see it. They knew that birds notice changes that escape our attention. And they knew that silence can sometimes be more important than sound. So what exactly causes a bird to stop singing without warning? What does it know that we do not? And why have scientists spent decades studying this seemingly simple behavior? Today we are going to explore one of the most overlooked signals in the natural world. A signal hiding in plain sight in backyards across America. The sudden silence of a bird. But before we continue, think about your own yard. Have you ever heard birds singing normally, only to have everything go quiet all at once? Did you ever stop and wonder why? Keep that question in your mind, because the answer begins with something most people never learn about birds. Birdsong is not music, at least not from the bird's perspective. To us it sounds beautiful. To them it is information. Every note carries meaning. Every call serves a purpose, and every silence tells a story. To understand that story, we first need to understand how birds experience the world. Imagine being a small songbird. You weigh less than a handful of coins. Almost everything around you is bigger than you. Cats hunt you. Hawks hunt you. Snakes hunt you. Even the weather can become a threat. Every day is a balance between finding food and avoiding danger. That is why birds are constantly paying attention. Not occasionally. Not when they feel like it. Every second. A bird that stops paying attention does not survive for long. Over millions of years, this pressure created something remarkable. Birds became experts at detecting subtle changes, a shadow moving across the ground, a branch bending in an unusual way, a distant sound carried by the wind, a movement that lasts only a fraction of a second. Things most humans never notice. And when a bird detects something dangerous, it often does not scream. It does not panic. Instead, it does something much more effective. It becomes silent. This may seem strange at first. Wouldn't it make more sense to warn everyone loudly? Sometimes birds do exactly that. Many species have alarm calls designed specifically to alert nearby birds. But there are situations where making noise creates even more danger. Imagine a hawk gliding silently above your neighborhood. The hawk is searching, listening, watching. The last thing a small bird wants to do is advertise its location. So the safest response is often complete silence. Every bird nearby understands the message immediately. Something is wrong. Stay hidden. Stay still. Wait. The remarkable thing is how quickly this happens. If you have ever been sitting outside when birds suddenly stopped singing all at once, you may have witnessed this response yourself. One moment everything sounds normal. The next moment the entire area seems frozen. Many people describe it as eerie, almost unsettling, as though nature itself is holding its breath. And in a way, that is exactly what is happening. But here is where things become even more interesting. Sometimes the birds are reacting to something humans can eventually see. A hawk, a cat, a fox moving along a fence line. Other times they seem to react before the danger becomes obvious. Long before you notice dark clouds forming. Long before you hear distant thunder. Long before conditions begin to change around you. Scientists have spent decades studying how animals respond to environmental shifts. What they found is fascinating. Many birds appear to detect subtle changes in air pressure, changes in humidity, changes in wind patterns, changes that signal approaching weather systems. To a bird, a storm does not suddenly arrive. It announces itself hours in advance, and birds respond accordingly. They feed differently, they move differently, and sometimes they become unusually quiet. This is one reason experienced birdwatchers often pay attention, not only to what birds are doing, but also to what they are not doing. Because absence can be information, silence can be information, a missing song can be information. Nature speaks in patterns, and when those patterns change, there is usually a reason. But temporary silence is only one part of the story. A far more important question is this: what happens when the birds do not come back? What happens when the silence lasts for weeks, or months, or even years? That is the kind of silence that deserves our attention most, because unlike a passing hawk or an approaching storm, long-term silence often points to something much bigger, something that affects not only birds, but entire ecosystems. And that is where the warning becomes impossible to ignore. Because when birds disappear for a few minutes, the cause is usually temporary. When they disappear for a season, the cause may be local, but when they disappear year after year, something deeper is happening. Think back to your childhood. Can you remember the sounds that filled summer evenings? For many people, the answer is easy. Birds, crickets, cicadas, a constant background chorus that seemed as permanent as the sky itself. Now ask yourself another question. Does your neighborhood sound the same today? For countless people across North America, Europe, and many other parts of the world, the answer is no. Something has changed. And often the first sign is not what you see. It is what you stop hearing. This is why scientists sometimes refer to birds as indicator species. An indicator species is an organism whose presence reveals the condition of an environment. In simple terms, birds are nature's reporters. They do not tell us what is happening with words. They show us through their behavior. When food is abundant, birds thrive. When water is clean, birds thrive. When ecosystems are healthy, birds sing. But when those conditions begin to break down, birds often respond before humans notice the problem. One of the biggest reasons is surprisingly simple: food. Most people think birds eat seeds, and many do, but what often surprises people is how heavily birds depend on insects, especially during nesting season. A single family of songbirds may collect thousands of insects to raise a brood of chicks. Thousands. Every caterpillar, every beetle, every tiny flying insect matters. Now imagine what happens when those insects begin to disappear. At first, nothing seems different. The flowers still bloom. The grass still grows. The trees still stand. Everything appears normal. Yet beneath the surface, an important link in the food chain is weakening. The birds notice first, because they must. Their survival depends on it. A parent bird searching for food cannot afford to ignore declining insect populations. If finding food becomes difficult, nesting success drops. Fewer chicks survive. Fewer young birds return the following year. And gradually, almost invisibly, the songs become less common. This process is slow enough that many people never notice it happening, until one day they realize a species they used to see every week has vanished. And then another, and then another. The silence spreads so gradually that it feels normal, but normal is not always natural. Researchers around the world have documented significant declines in bird populations over the past several decades, not because of a single disaster, not because of a single disease, but because of countless small changes accumulating over time. Loss of habitat, declining insect populations, artificial light at night, expanding cities, fragmented forests. Each change may seem minor by itself. Together, they reshape entire ecosystems. And birds respond, sometimes by moving elsewhere, sometimes by breeding less successfully, sometimes by simply becoming quieter. This is why the disappearance of birdsong deserves attention, not because silence itself is dangerous, but because silence often points toward a larger story, a story unfolding around us whether we notice it or not. And there is another surprising reason birds may stop visiting a garden, one that many homeowners never consider. The garden may look beautiful to us, but it may not feel safe to them. A wide-open lawn may seem attractive from a human perspective, yet for a small bird it can feel exposed, vulnerable, risky. Birds need cover. They need shrubs, dense branches, protected spaces where they can hide from predators. Without those features, even a perfectly maintained yard can become a place birds avoid, which leads to an important realization. A bird does not judge a garden the way humans do. It judges a garden based on survival. Can I find food here? Can I find water here? Can I hide here? Can I raise young here? Can I survive here? If the answer is yes, birds stay. If the answer is no, birds leave. And when enough birds leave, the silence begins. But there is something hopeful hidden inside this idea. Because if birds respond to negative changes, they also respond to positive ones. Nature is far more resilient than many people realize, and sometimes the return of birds can happen faster than anyone expects. The question is how? How do you turn a quiet garden back into a living one? How do you invite the songs back? And perhaps most importantly, how do you learn to recognize the messages birds are sending before the silence arrives in the first place? The answer begins with something surprisingly simple: learning to listen. Not in the way a scientist listens, not in the way a researcher records data, just paying attention. Most people notice when a bird appears. Few people notice when a bird stops appearing. Most people hear birdsong. Few people remember which species were singing. Yet every healthy garden has a rhythm, a pattern, a baseline. And once you become familiar with that baseline, changes become much easier to recognize. You begin to notice which birds arrive first in the morning, which ones sing from the tallest trees, which ones visit your yard during different seasons. You start to understand that a backyard is not just a collection of plants, it is a living community, and every member of that community tells part of a larger story. The good news is that birds are surprisingly willing to return when conditions improve. Sometimes the changes needed are small: a source of clean water, a native shrub, a few flowering plants that attract insects, a corner of the garden left slightly wild. What appears insignificant to us can be incredibly valuable to wildlife. A shallow bird bath may become the most visited location in the entire yard. A single native tree may support hundreds of insect species throughout the year. Those insects feed birds. Those birds raise chicks. Those chicks become the next generation of singers. And slowly, almost without noticing, the soundscape begins to change. First comes a single visitor, then another, then a familiar song you have not heard in months. And suddenly, the silence that once seemed permanent begins to break. This is one of the most encouraging lessons nature teaches. Life wants to return. Given the opportunity, ecosystems often begin healing themselves. Birds are usually among the first signs that recovery has begun. That is why many conservation projects measure success not only by what grows, but by what sings. The return of birds is often the return of balance, the return of insects, the return of healthy habitat, the return of connections that may have been missing for years. And perhaps that brings us back to the most important question of all. What was the warning hidden inside the silence? The answer is not always danger. Sometimes it is. Sometimes a predator is nearby. Sometimes a storm is approaching. Sometimes a sudden disturbance has changed the behavior of every animal in the area. But long-term silence often carries a different message. Pay attention. Something has changed. Something in the environment is different from what it once was. The birds are not judging. They are not making a statement. They are simply responding to reality. And because they respond so quickly and so honestly, they become some of the most reliable messengers in the natural world. They do not speculate. They do not exaggerate. They simply react to the conditions around them. When conditions improve, they return. When conditions decline, they leave. Their songs rise and fall with the health of the world they inhabit. That is why the bird that suddenly went silent matters. Not because silence is mysterious, but because silence is information. It is a signal, a clue, a message waiting to be understood. The next time you step into your backyard and notice the birds singing, take a moment to appreciate it. Those sounds are doing more than filling the air. They are telling you something about the place you call home. And if one day those sounds suddenly disappear, do not ignore it. Ask yourself a simple question: what changed? Because the answer may reveal far more than you expect. Has a bird ever disappeared from your yard for weeks or months and then unexpectedly returned? Or is there a species you used to hear all the time that seems strangely absent today? Tell me in the comments. These observations are often more important than people realize. And if you would like to discover another hidden signal that nature is sending every day right outside your door, there is another story waiting for you, one that most people walk past without ever noticing. And once you see it, you may never look at your backyard the same way again.